In our first episode, we looked at how the author set the scene for the whole story of the book of Ruth. So let's move on from that scene setting in the prologue to see how the story now unfolds. Let's move on to what I've called Act 1, thinking of it as a play. Act 1 in this story I've called The Return. And this amazing story begins with realization in verses 6 to 7. Let's read those verses. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So the story proper begins with a realization that the famine back in Judah is over. Naomi hears that, quote, the Lord had come to the aid of his people. Well, of course he had, because that's what God had always wanted to do. That's what he would promise he would do. Remember, I referred in the first episode to Deuteronomy 28, where in the first 5 verses, God promises that if they will obey him, then there'll be rich blessing on their lives, their families, their herds, their crops. But if there wasn't, then the very lack of those things would show that he was no longer with them. Obedience, Moses had said in that passage, will lead to blessing. Disobedience would always lead to curse. Well, in this cycle of life that they were going round, the Israelites had moved out of their disobedience into a phase of obedience, and so God's blessing had returned. Do take a look at those passages in Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 to 6 and verses 15 to 19. They're well worth pausing this recording and just reading them before we move on. But let's go back to Naomi. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people. Now that expression, had come to the aid, is a very particular expression in Hebrew. Hebrew is the language of the Old Testament. And it's an expression that always conveys some sense of God's sovereign, gracious act on behalf of his people when they don't deserve it, when they can't do anything to help. It's used, for example, in Genesis 21, verse 1, where we read that the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and did for Sarah what he had promised. Abraham and Sarah, you'll remember, had been barren for years, but God had promised them a child. And at the right time, he came to the aid of Sarah. He was gracious to Sarah. It's this same word in Hebrew. It's when Abraham and Sarah could do nothing to change their situation that God stepped in. It's when Naomi and the people of Israel could do nothing to change their situation that God stepped in. Our God is still the same God. He loves to do that. He loves to come and step in when we come to the point of recognizing there is nothing we can do to fix this or to change it. He loves to come to our aid, just as he did for Naomi, just as he will love to do for you today. God always loves to come to the aid of his people, especially when we come to the end of ourselves. To be honest, I'm a bit of a Mr. Fixie. I like to be able to work it and make things work, and frankly, I get frustrated when I can't, but again and again I've seen in life, it's when I come to the end of myself, see, I can't fix it. None of my efforts, not even my praying can change it, and just give it all to God. that again and again he steps in and comes to my aid. He can do the same for you. And I felt I wanted to add at this point that perhaps there's someone watching this recording today who has drifted from God. You are not as close to God as you used to be. And I think it's because you found yourself in some difficult situation that at first you got disappointed about and then disillusioned about, and then your disillusionment became I just can't be bothered, and slowly you drifted from God. Today, God wants to come to your aid. All you have to do is acknowledge where you are, where you've been, and call to him to come and rescue, to come to the point of realization that you need his aid, just like Naomi did. So the first step in this amazing story of the return is realization. The second step is what I've called invitation in verses 8 to 13. So let's read that part of the story now. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "But we'll go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Having heard that the famine back in Judah is over, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law set off to return home, back to Bethlehem. But it's on the journey that Naomi suddenly realizes, come on, girl, what on earth do you think you're doing? Why are you taking your 2 widowed daughters-in-law with you? They're going to be strangers, refugees there. They're not going to be welcomed. And how are you going to provide for them? There's no one in your family who can. Remember, she doesn't know there is someone who can at this stage in the story. I certainly couldn't have a husband, and even if I did and had a son, would they wait until that son were old enough to marry? No, I'm just being really selfish here. I really need to send them home. And so she gives them this invitation to go back to Moab, where they could at least get a life for themselves. Now, I think there's 2 things going on in Naomi's thinking at this point. On the one hand, there is incredible selflessness, because sending them back to Moab would mean that she were left completely desolate with no one. Being a widow in those days was incredibly difficult if you had no extended family to call upon, no social security in those days to help you out, of course. And so she would have been incredibly bereft. And I think the depth of their relationship shows in the way that her 2 daughters-in-law just weep with her and at first say, "Mother-in-law, no, we can't abandon you. We can't go back." And impressing them for them to go back, Naomi is being incredibly selfless. But there's something else going on as well, because on the other hand, another emotion comes out, and that is hopelessness. In verse 11, Naomi says, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come home with me. Actually, our English versions don't really convey the tone of the Hebrew there, because it isn't really a question, it's a correction. What the Hebrew really says is, no, my daughters, you are wrong to come with me. You're wrong to come with me. Why? Because there's no way that I could provide for you in the future. She sees no hope for them. This is hopelessness. And then watch out, because now that hopelessness starts to drift into something else. It seeks to drift into an even deeper emotion, one of bitterness. In verse 13. No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Oh dear. The selflessness has drifted into self-pity. But isn't that what can happen at times? You know, as we start to process things and think them through, and rather than dealing with the thoughts and grabbing a hold of them, we just let them run. It can happen to all of us, just as it happened to Naomi. And she lets her thoughts run, and it goes with the flow, to the point where by verse 20, she'll be saying to people, don't call me Naomi anymore. Naomi means pleasant. Call me instead Mara, which means bitter. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter, because of the bitterness that's hit my life. Oh my goodness, she has gone down the downward spiral of self-pity. And the trouble is, once we start going down that spiral, we lose any sense of perspective, because look again at what she said. No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you. Whoa, hang on a minute, lady. Yes, you've lost your husband and your two sons, but remember, these two young women have lost their husbands, and while you're at the end of your life, they're still at the beginning of their life. They've got a whole life ahead of them with nothing to look forward to, in grief of having lost their husband, and you're saying it's more bitter for me than for you. But that's what starts to happen when we go down the road of hopelessness and bitterness and self-pity, and it is all about me. We start to lose perspective, just like Naomi did. So let me ask you a question. Is there some area of your life where you have lost perspective, where you've become so consumed with what's gone on, what's gone wrong in your own life, that you can no longer see the need of others? You know, none of us need ever be in a place of thinking the Lord has turned his hand against me, as Naomi said. God loved us enough to give Jesus his son to die on the cross for us. And Paul says in Romans 8, he who gave his only son for us, will he not also give us all things along with him? If we have Jesus, we have everything we need. And we don't need to walk the path of Naomi, the path of bitterness and self-pity. We just need to recognize it, draw a line, and call to God to come and get us out of it. Because as we'll see in the next episode, the God of redemption always has a card up his sleeve.